I've been listening to Soulfly for a long time, and with Totem releasing, it's finally time to rank them all. Alright, this is going to be a fun one, and let's just jump right in with Soulfly in 1998. Now, I'm particularly biased towards these first two albums because they were my jams in high school, and even that aside, this debut just goes super hard, and rightly so considering it's in part a dedication to Max's murdered stepson. So many banger tracks with a lot of great guest musicians. That opening riff on Eye for an Eye really sets the tone with Dino and Burton from Fear Factory. First Commandment does a great job of playing with contrasting super heavy and super quiet sections with Chino from Deftones, Benji Webb of Skindred and DJ Lethal guest on Quilombo, and even Fred Durst's appearance on Bleed goes crazy hard. Not to mention that atmosphere on this thing is just brilliant with all the awesome tribal sounding, drumming, chanting, Portuguese lyrics. It basically takes what Roots did and cranks it up to 11. There's a reason this made my top 10 new metal albums list, and I think it still stands out among the rest. It was certified gold. Easy S tier to kick things off. Then they followed that up with Primitive in 2000, and so it was hard to top that debut, but this is a great one to come after it, continuing on with all those same elements that made it work so well. Back to the Primitive makes for another great opener with equal parts pure headbanging and cultural adoration, even incorporating the Brazilian berimbau. Plenty of other awesome additional instrumentation here too, including Congo drums, sitar, twang, and various wind instruments alongside more hype chanting parts. Then we get even more insane guest features, the likes of which I would say is one of the craziest lineups I've ever seen on a single album. Pain has both Chino making a return alongside Grady Avenell of Will Haven, Jump to Fuck Up, which right down to its title is just peak new metal, features Corey Taylor. They even got Tom from freaking Slayer on the thrashy Terrorist. And then of all people, John Lennon's son Sean for Sun Song, which is one of my all-time favorites from the band. Honestly, the only part of this album I don't love are the kind of R&B backing vocals on Fly High, but it's far from a deal breaker. Again, these first two really capture the spirit of what I love most about the band, and I don't think they've ever fully matched that since then. Another easy one to put at S tier. So then we got the simply titled 3 in 2002, and this is where I kind of jumped ship with the band originally, as I remember being really disappointed with it when it came out. The production is a bit different sounding, which I think is part of what put me off, a bit more stripped back and even kind of flat sounding in comparison to the previous levels of atmosphere. It very much sounds like people in a studio versus on the last two where I feel like I'm hearing like the actual open air of Brazil. On the positive side of the track list, Downstroy is a decent opener, Seek and Strike is a fine single, albeit kind of a lesser retread of other songs. Here we go! Another day, another strike! Here we go! It's the living sacrifice! Here we go! Last of the Mohicans and Call to Arms are pretty fun. Brasil appropriately leans again into the Portuguese and tribal elements, as do the various instrumentals at the end, though I think that these would have been better scattered throughout the runtime instead of just packed all back to back. And the drumming in general consistently continues to be one of my favorite elements of the band at this point. On the negative, I'm not a big fan of One, which features Christian Machado of El Nino, and the opening of Tree of Pain is just kind of lame, which no shade to Asha Rabuin, but she's also the one who did those vocals I mentioned on Fly High. She has a great voice, just not something I really want on these albums. This one's grown on me, but it's definitely not on the same level and lacking the same spark, I would say. So this one's going to B tier. Then we got Prophecy in 2004. So this one was a real treat to finally check out when I did not too long ago, really, and it had me kicking myself for ignoring it for so long. The title track is a solid opener with banging drums and Max coming with just full fury. I see the red sea parting from domain. I see the desert clouds lit above me. Living Sacrifice is a rager, bringing those wailing guitars. Love the big solo on Execution Style along with that great scream-along chorus. Loving the once more stepped-up world music influences on tracks like Mars, Moses, and Parada. And by the way, the drummer Joe Nunez actually worked at my local Guitar Center, and I went to school with his half-sister. I just happened to run into him when I was getting some equipment. Really nice guy. And then David Ellefson of Megadeth actually did some of the bass along with the guy from Primer 55. Really solid actually, with a lot of diversity while still being very consistent. Even the In the Meantime helmet cover is pretty awesome. I'm putting this one at S tier. And they followed that up with Dark Ages in 2005, and once more Max had a lot to be pissed off about with this album, as it was recorded in the wake of another family death in his 8-month-old grandson, as well as the murder of his good friend Dimebag Darrell. And I'd say that definitely once more comes through in the music. Babylon kicks things off on a seriously heavy and infectious note, followed up quickly with these skanky beats and squealing solos of I and I. Arise Again has some fun thrash riffs and start-stop rhythms. The main riff on Frontlines is a total ripper. And yet again, some really delightful world music influences and Portuguese lyrics to break things up and help give it that extra unique twist. I still don't love it as much as these top three, but it's good enough that I'm putting it at A. I was kind of surprised to see that this was actually the highest audience ranked album on Metal Storm by a pretty wide margin, even beating out the first two by a full grade almost. But let's move on to Conquer in 2008. So Max Cavalera stated in an interview that he had been heavily influenced by Bolt Thrower, Napalm Death, and Slayer in writing for this album, which he declared at the time would make Dark Ages sound like a pop album. That's a pretty tall order. Now, rightly so, Bloodfire War Hate kicks off full thrash mode, calling back to Sepultura, and even has guest vocals from Morbid Angel's David Vincent. Same energy goes for Fall of the Sycophants, big doomy riffs on Touching the Void, and a pretty rad groovy middle section. Warmageddon is a slower, more Metallica-esque chugger in the vein of something like Sad But True. Pretty killer bass line on this one too. Tons of great soloing, but on the flip side, Unleash feels a bit overlong. Doom is kind of uninspired until it gets to the chill part, and this is easily one of the worst Soulfly interludes. And there are some banger tracks here, but it's a little bit inconsistent as a full album. I'm giving this one kind of like a B-. Then we got Omen in 2010, and I gotta say, like, right from the outset, tracks like Blood Red and Beyond, Lethal Injection, Off With Their Heads, and Great Depression feel a little generic in their riffs at this point, and then Max's vocals likewise feel kind of lacking in the bloodlust that make his more simplistic style lyrics work. He's no poet, but when he belts it out, it gets you pumped. Rise of the Fallen calls back more to the earlier material with the big groove and also a little sitar. Greg Puciato of the Dillinger Escape Plan also provides additional vocals, and that sounds like a dream on paper, but a little bit clunky in execution. Again, some great soloing, but falls even shorter this time pretty much everywhere else, I would say. Really light on the regional influences too, aside from a few sprinkles here and there. Frankly, it's also just pretty dull by comparison to these other albums I've talked about so far, with not even really one, like, great standout track, in my opinion. And this was also kind of their first just real flop, I would say. So I'm putting this one at D tier. Luckily though, they kind of rallied a bit for Enslaved in 2012, bringing in Tony Campos of Static X and Fear Factory on bass, and also the only album to feature former Borknagar drummer David Kincaid on drums. Love the crunchy bass intro of World Scum, as well as the always raunchy snarls of Travis from Cattle Decapitation, another great guest part there. Gladiator is another groovy banger with some of the primitive energy as well as more sitar. Legions bringing that wailing wah effect that I also love. It's kind of another trademark element I associate with Soulfly. Max sounding ultra pissed on the intro of Treachery. Des Fafara of Coal Chamber and Devil Driver guests on Redemption of Man by God, which seems like such a no-brainer in retrospect that I can't believe that this feature didn't happen sooner. Still a bit light on the world music and tribal elements, but it's nice to hear the Portuguese and Spanish guitar on Plata o Plomo. Definitely missed that. Notably, no Soulfly interlude either, which at this point is fine by me. Like, Chains and Revengeance make for a much stronger conclusion. This is also their last release on Roadrunner Records. I'm putting this one at A tier. Next is Savages in 2013, so just a year later, produced by Terry Date, who also did 3, Prophecy, and Dark Ages. This is their first album on Nuclear Blast. Max's son Zion is on drums, and his other son Igor is also on lead single Bloodshed, which, while this is very wholesome, to be totally honest, it's pretty underwhelming. Some other guests here too, including Declare War's Jamie Hanks, Clutch's Neil Fallon, and Napalm Death's Mitch Harris. That last one in particular should also be something that almost makes me fall in love with this album, but it's just not fully in service of something. Similar to Omen, it just feels a bit undercooked and unremarkable overall, and lacking really memorable tracks. It's a bit overlong too, at almost an hour. I'm also putting this one at D tier. Then we got Archangel in 2015, and this is actually the lowest rated album on Metal Storm at a miserable 6.8, which I don't fully agree with. I don't think it's a great album, but I don't think it's their worst by any stretch. We Sold Our Souls to Metal is really obnoxious, admittedly, and not a good way to open the album. The title track also feels like it kind of meanders all over the place, feels like they've kind of lost their focus on this one. It almost feels like a garage jam session, and honestly, in my opinion, again, it's not bad, it's just lacking in structure and intensity. It does have some cool moments and interesting atmosphere, and I would at least rather listen to this than Omen or Savages. So, gonna put this at C tier. This is also their second lowest charting album. Then there's Ritual in 2018, and Max said, for this one we really tried to retain the groove of early Soulfly as well as my love for the heavy, fast stuff I'm into, and I'd say that it delivers on that balance pretty well. Nice to finally hear some tribal elements on the title track to open things up, as well as the hand drums and chanting on parts of Blood on the Street. Dead Behind the Eyes is a great follow-up with some of that Lamb of God energy in both the riffs and Randy Blythe's guest vocals. Ross Dolan of Immolation features on the slow, lumbering groove of Under Rapture, which is definitely on the heavy side of things. Bite the Bullet has both great riffs and drumming across the board. Feedback is fun with the clear Motorhead energy, and it actually has a decent Soulfly instrumental that captures some of that original spirit. Pretty concise too at 43 minutes, produced by Josh Wilbur. I'm putting this one at B tier. And that brings us to Totem in 2022. So given the inconsistency of those last few albums, I went into this new one with relatively low expectations, but hoping it would at least be more in line with that last one. Now off the bat, once more, I will say that especially given the theme and cover art, I still find myself a little disappointed that Soulfly aren't incorporating all of those great regional instruments and tribal elements that made me fall in love with the band to begin with. But that aside, they've still done a decent job of melding that atmosphere and overall spirit into the music. We do get some more overt nods here and there, especially on Soulfly 12, which feels like a return to form for these instrumentals, as well as the chanting, drumming, and kind of reggae-esque closing section of the nearly 10-minute closer, Spirit Animal, which also features guest vocals from Richie of Insight and soloing from Chris of Power Trip and Mammoth Grinder. But mostly the default approach here is a pretty straightforward groove metal style. And as far as how that pans out, no complaints here, with absolute ragers like Scouring the Vial, which also features John Tardy of Obituary. Definitely one of my favorites of the album, alongside the pummeling Ancestors. The almost Tom G. Warrior sounding flavor grunts and snarls on The Damage Done had me making the stank face more than once. Love the very nu metal throwback vibes of the title track before it makes that surprise transition into thrash territory. The Rain and Blood inspired Filth Upon Filth is another standout with its incredibly infectious chugs and fuck the world attitude. Really just tons of super heavy headbanging riffs and ripping solos in general, and honestly, this may be their most pissed off sounding record since Dark Ages. Genuinely, there's very little not to love without a single dud, and as far as Soulfly records go, this easily exceeded my expectations in just how consistently energetic and engaging it is all the way through. So all that said, I'm gonna put this one at A tier and pretty high up at that. Y'all let me know how you would rank these albums in the comments, even if it's different, and check out this playlist for a lot of new metal related videos. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.